All right, this lesson is on section 4.1 and it's entitled Inverses. And that's what we're going to talk about. So if you were in class, I have an activity where I have definitions, the words and the definitions, and you kind of do a matching type game. But since you're not in class and you're needing to watch the video, you can either go to the key terms and kind of look those over, okay? But the review of what we did last chapter, domain, range, independent variable, dependent variable, all things that you've had before. So that worked out pretty well. All right, so what I'm going to have you do for this lesson is I'm actually going to have you print off the study guide for section 4.1 off of Apex, or you can get it from me, or you can just take your own notes too. If you're at home and you're not able to do that, you don't have a printer, you can certainly take your own notes, but I would kind of pause so that you can write some of these key things down. All right, so we're talking about inverses. Well, what is an inverse? An inverse is a function or relation that we say it undoes. It undoes the work of another. So you've maybe had someone ask you, what's the inverse of adding? Or what undoes adding? And usually students are able to say, well, subtracting. Or what undoes multiplying, dividing? All right, so here's an example. If a function adds 3, its inverse subtracts 3. Okay, in function notation, the inverse of f of x is written as f inverse with a little -1 exponent. That stands for inverse, f inverse of x. All right, so part 2, just to get some notes. Write domain and range, and this is kind of review if you look at this part. The blank of a function is a blank of its inverse. What are they looking for? Well, it says underneath, so the inputs of the function are the outputs of the inverse. And I know that sounds really strange, but basically what it's saying is if you have a point x and y in one function, it's a point yx in the other. You know, domain and range can stand for input and output. So here we're saying the inputs, which remember is your domain, the domain of the function is the range of its inverse, and you can switch it around. The range of the function, or the outputs, is the domain of its inverse. So what is that all saying? It's kind of just saying if two functions are inverses, the x and y, the inputs and outputs, get reversed. And you'll kind of see what it means, or it'll make more sense in a minute. But basically a rule, if you have a function, input is x and the output's y typically, well, if you want the inverse, then the input's your y and the output's your x. So before we go on to finding the inverse of an equation, they kind of did some examples with mappings. So if you had a mapping 1, 2, 3, maps to 4, 5, 6, kind of like so, and you had that mapping, the inverse would be taking 4, 5, 6, taking the range, and mapping it to the domain. So basically it would be reversing. The 4 now goes to 1, the 5 now goes to 2, and the 6 now goes to 3. So if this is a function or a mapping, this is the inverse of that function. Okay, that's kind of re-saying what this says here in a different way. All right, so basically what the skill we're going to ask you to do is take a function right here, f of x equals x plus 3, and write down what the inverse is. Now let's think about this for a minute. What would undo adding 3? And you would say, well, subtracting 3. So as you see, as we go through this process of finding mathematically the inverse of this function, it's basically going to be subtracting 3. So we are going to follow a little process. You can follow these steps. And again, if you don't have the study guide, go ahead and just use this problem as a sample in your notes. But we're going to replace f of x with y and write this as y equals x plus 3. Okay, so then to find the inverse, what we want to do is we want to replace, we want to swap, not replace, I guess, swap the x and y. So write this as x equals y plus 3. And then we want to solve it for y. You can see step 3, solve for y. So to solve for y, I would subtract 3. So I get x minus 3 equals y. All right, so unfortunately the page is ended here, so I got to go to the next. So we had here x minus 3 equals y was our last step. So it says put y on the left side. So the inverse is y equals x minus 3. And then to write it in the proper notation, remember our original was, I'll write over here, f of x equals x plus 3. Well, the inverse is f inverse of x equals x minus 3. So x minus 3 undoes the function x plus 3. How can we check that? Now, this is kind of a key thing that comes up that you need to know here. You can use we learned this in the last chapter, composition. We can compose the functions to check that they're inverses of each other. Now, I know, again, this looks really strange. It looks like a foreign language here. If f inverse of f of x equals x, then f inverse is the inverse of f of x. So what does that mean? That means if I take f inverse of f of x right here, if I take f of x and I put it into here, okay, I compose it, I put it in there, and I get x, they're inverses of each other. So if I put that in, that gives me f inverse of f of x equals x plus 3 minus 3. So I'm putting the x plus 3 in. If I do that, look what happens. Those are gone. What do I get? I get x. So what it's saying there is if you compose f inverse of f of x, if you put f of x into f inverse, you should get x if they're inverses of each other. Rule, to find the inverse of any function, okay, so this is different now. Now we're going to move to, so if you understand that information that I just went over, there's 2 quizzes in this section. There's 4.1.3 and then 4.1.4. So if you understood this about the steps of this past problem, you should be able to take the first quiz. It's just your basic exchanging your x and y and replacing them and switching them and undoing the functions. You should be fine on the first quiz. The second quiz then deals with, well, what if we have a function and it doesn't say f of x? Okay, it's p of s. Okay, so what's our rule to solving something like that? To find the inverse of any function, take the original equation and solve for the input variable. Okay, so we're going to write this, instead of p of s, we're going to write this as p. P equals 2s plus 3. So it's basically the same thing, okay? But we're going to solve for the input variable then. The input's the s. So we're going to solve this for s just like we solved for y before. So just subtract 3. So p minus 3 equals 2s. How do you undo multiplying by 2? Divide by 2. So s is equal to, or p minus 3 over 2 equals s. And so it says put the input variable on the left side. So s is equal to p minus 3 over 2. And then we can rewrite it as, instead of, notice the original was p of s. Now the inverse is s of p equals p minus 3 over 2. Now notice, if you look at the original function, p of s, we had a plus 3. Notice in the inverse, we have a minus 3. Notice in the original function, there's a 2 times. Right here, 2 times. And notice here, right here, we're dividing. Okay, so if you weren't in class and weren't able to hear the discussion, basically that's what we went over in class, but we had a lot more examples and things. So if you have questions, please come see me. I would replay the video and look over these two to just refresh. But that's the main concept here in inverses.